So today I'm going to be talking about the tiling and offset node within the shader graph. So if you've watched my last videos, I've been diving into shader graph, kind of going over piece by piece, and we made a basic shader graph and learned about glow effects and colors and controlling that a little bit. So now I'm going to dive into what the tiling and offset node actually does. I've watched a number of videos on making some pretty cool shaders, and it's used quite a bit. And how it actually works and what it's doing is very important to understand. I mean, you can plug it in and you can kind of see the results, but what is it doing and why is it doing it is important to really wrap your head around. And so I'm going to be going through step by step exactly what it's doing and how it interacts with the UV map. And that's another thing that you really need to understand is what is the UV map. It's one of the inputs, that UV0. And I'll kind of be going over that and going through some demonstrations of modifying the UV map in Blender and then bringing that into Unity and kind of seeing the results and how that affects the tiling and offset, because they are interconnected. So let's dive into Unity and Blender and figure all this out. So before I get into talking about the shader, I want to talk a little bit about exactly what the UV map is. I will go into UV map obviously more as this video goes on, but we have to wrap our heads around exactly what the UV map is doing. And to see that, I'm in Blender. I just made a simple plane. And if we go into UV editing, what I have is I have a sample image here just in the background so we can see kind of what it's doing. And what we have here is the UV points. So this UV point here matches up with this pixel here. There's one UV point for every vertice on our plane. And what it's going to do is once we map this image to a material, the UV map is going to map what pixel in the image is going to show up on what part of our mesh. And the plane is the simplest way to do that. So I've already created a material. Again, I created a material with our image. We can see it showing up there. And the image is part of my base color right here. You see base color in my image, my low poly palette PNG. So you can see as my plane is being rendered, the renderer to draw the plane says, what pixel should I show here? My first pixel on my mesh. Oh, let's go to my UV map, which is here, and it's going to grab this pixel because this is where the UV map's pixel is pointing. If I grab this and move it, you'll notice that it moves. See, if I stretch this off the top, it says, hey, where's my first pixel? Oh, it's way up here. It's off my image. So that's why that's black. Let's rotate around so we can see it a little bit better. Actually, it looks like it wrapped around to that lower left-hand corner. So we'll undo that. So it's going to march across here saying, hey, give me a pixel, give me a pixel, give me a pixel, give me a pixel until it reaches the end, and then it's going to come back. It's going to scan all of our pixel lines of our mesh. So the UV is really a map of what part of my image should map onto which colored pixels onto my plane. If we grab all this, scale it down, we can see now that upper left-hand corner is this brown part of this palette. So that's why this is brown now. So understanding this is going to be important and really getting a picture of your head exactly what the UV map is doing as we move on to the rest of our videos. We're going to come in here and I'm going to go into edit mode. I'm going to subdivide it. So we have a basic plane with 4 faces. Very simple. And it's important to start with a simple object because then you can kind of picture what's going on. So I'm going to go into UV editing. And it's called UV editing because this shows me the UV points. And right now what it's doing is it is putting a UV point on every single point of each face, which there is one UV point for every vertice in your mesh. It's important to understand that. And this kind of normally would be used if I brought in an image and I was mapping my mesh onto an image. And that's really what we're going to be doing with the tiling and offset. We're going to be mapping and manipulating the UV map, but onto an image which we're providing ourselves in our shader. So I'm not bringing in the image from Blender. I'm actually including the image in the shader, and I'll show you how that works. So this is just the default, right, UV map that Blender puts on, and you can manipulate this, but we're not going to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the layout. I'm going to export this plane, and I'm going to export it into a Unity project. If you've been watching my other videos, it's the same project that I've been building on, making shaders and other things. So this is the path to it. It's where my import folder is on the project, and I'm going to call it sample plane. I have my selected objects, apply transform. I'm going to click export. And I'm going to come down here. I'm going to bring up my Unity. There's a lot of stuff on the screen, and hopefully you can see it all because there's a lot of things going on here. So what I've done is I've created a shader, and if you don't know how to make a shader, you can watch my video making my first shader to go through all the steps in getting to this point of creating a new shader. And I've added a couple nodes to start with. So of course we have our fragment. And one kind of confusing thing is this base color. It's called base color, but of course if you've ever mapped other images onto a material, you know that base color can be fed in RGB out of an image itself. And that's what I have here. What I have is I've brought in a texture 2D asset. So I've just created a node. If you type texture, you can see that there's a couple different options, and one is texture 2D asset. So that's what this guy is. Created a texture 2D asset. I've clicked on this little circle, and up comes, these are all the images that happen to be in my project at the time. And I picked this red box with an arrow because it's very helpful, and I use this when figuring things out because you can see what direction your graphic is going to be facing when it's mapped onto your mesh once we're all finished making our shader. So I've selected this red box, and it looks like this. It's an arrow with a red box with the arrow pointing down. And then I can't feed this. You'll notice that this has to feed into, this red dot has to feed into a texture input, and the RGB has to feed into the base color. I can't feed this directly into the base color. I need this sample texture 2D. Now I'm not sure exactly what these do, except that it puts it into a format that I can feed into my base color. You'll notice this has a UV in to it. This UV0 is going to be the UV that's part of my mesh that the shader applies to. That's what this UV0 is representing. It's representing those points we saw in Blender that we brought in. And so that's being fed into here. It's just the default, exactly what came in from Blender. And I am feeding that out to my base color. So essentially this shader is simply taking this image and going to map it onto whatever mesh that I have assigned it to. So let's go over to the scene. Let's make sure this is saved. Let's go over to our scene. Let's remove that just so we can drag it on again. So we have our sample plane, and when I drag it on, we can see that it's just black. It has no material map to it. It's just this lit material. Then if we see this tiling and shader material, so I've made a material out of my shader already. And again, if you don't know how to do that, you can watch my first shader video. I'll put the link in the details of the description. And you can see that my image shows up. It's a texture 2D. I have my base color, that's just a default. And I had thrown in this offset variable, which I'm not going to use right now. So now if we grab this and drag it onto our plane, we can see that it's taken our image and our arrow is pointing up. Now I'm looking from the top and Z is up. And of course, this is the lower left-hand corner. This is 0 or some value that increases as I go up this plane, because that's the positive Z direction that I'm seeing. And if I go into my shader, you'll notice my image, of course, images, the 0 point is at the top going down. So this is going up in the positive direction. That's why the arrow is pointing up. So it's important to kind of understand how all these things are mapping together. All right, so I have my simple image and it's showing up on my scene. So what does the tiling and offset do? What it's going to do is it's going to optionally tile my image and or offset the image. And if we kind of see what happens when it's tiling, let's go back to Blender. Let's go back to our UV editing. And if I select all of my UV points, I can manipulate them. I can hit S, which, oops, I need to be over here. I hit S, which is going to scale my UVs. So if I scale them a lot bigger than the actual map to my image, let's see what's going to happen. So what we're going to do is we're going to re-export this, FBX, going to export it right over the one we already have in Unity. Go back into Unity. Let's go back to our scene and we can see what happened. What happened is when we stretch the UVs bigger than the image map, it's going to tile, meaning it's going to kind of, you have to think of it, it's going to be trying to grab all the pixels, right? It's going to map the pixels from our image, this represents the image, onto our mesh. And it's going to, when it gets to the top of the image, it runs out of pixels, it runs out of image, so then it wraps around the bottom and it keeps going. So that's why by dragging this bigger and off the top, it's going to wrap off the top and on the bottom. It's going to wrap off the left-hand side and onto the right-hand side. And essentially, it's going to tile my image. So if we select all, let's undo that. Let's re-export it just to kind of get back to a known state. All right. See, as soon as I exported it, it re-exported those UV map back to what it was, and my image goes back to normal. So now let's go to our tiling shader. Let's go over to our tiling and offset. Right now, my tiling is set to 1, 1, but let's set it to 2, 2. Let's feed the out. So you'll notice this has a UV in also. So the UV coming in is the UV map that we just exported from Blender. And I'm going to tile it 2 by 2. So I'm going to replace this UV map. This UV map is now the UV map from my mesh tiled 2 by 2. And you'll notice that now I have a 2 by 2 tile of my image. So really, it's just manipulating that UV map, just like we manipulated in Blender. It's no different. It's just mathematically, it's going to manipulate it so I get exactly a 2 by 2 tile of my image. Not used, tiling isn't used nearly as much as the offset is for, at least for cool effects. I mean, you can use it for, tiling in a big scene if you want to repeat your image across a big plane or something like that, and make a shader like that. You can also use just the plane materials have a tiling feature, so not really that useful, but just thought I'd go over everything. So let's set this back to, let's make it bigger. Let's make it like 5 by 5 just to make some more. Now let's go back into Blender, and what we're going to do is we're going to rotate this UV map. So let's see what happens if I rotate this 180 degrees. A little bit off. And now I export this. Let's see what happens. Let's come into here. Let's go to our scene. Did not update. Oop, actually, it did update. So before, you'll notice they were pointing up. Now they're pointing down. Because basically, we've just swapped the 0 point of all of our UVs. So we can affect how this shader looks on our UV map by manipulating our UVs in Blender. So that's important to know, because if you can't figure out why something looks quote unquote upside down, or it's going left to right versus right to left, you know that you can always manipulate the UVs in Blender. Let's export that again. So now we're back to pointing up. All right. So let's go to the next one, which is, let's zoom in. So what about offset? What is offset going to do? So I think I have, where is it? Yes, there's this offset float. I have a vector 2 here. Let's delete this. Let's feed this into our offset. Zoom in a little bit. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this down here. And again, if you don't know how to make these variables and kind of hook them up and expose them, again, it's in that my first shader video. So we're going to hook this up to the Y. And now you'll notice that my offset here is here, exposed in my material. That's this offset here. And let's go to our scene. And see if we can get this offset actually moving our tile, because that's what this offset's going to do, is it's going to shift all of the UV points in some direction. All right. So I've saved my asset, and remember, any changes you make here are not going to be reflected in the scene until you hit Save Asset. I had forgot to do that, so I've done that now. So let's go to our scene. Let's go to our slider and let's see what happens. So as I move the slider, you'll see that the image is being offset, and we can make it look like it's moving. So now you can see what the offset's doing. And really, all it's doing is it's the same as grabbing this. If I grab this in the Y direction and shift it up and down, this is what it's doing. It's just moving all of my UV points. And remember, if I'm off the top, it's going to wrap around the bottom, so it's never going to run out of pixels. So this slider kind of you can see what's going on there. One thing to note, and it was kind of confusing me at first because some of the materials weren't working. They weren't showing up in my shader. And I noticed that if we go to my images, you'll notice this is just this default texture type, but this is this Sprite and UI texture type because I've used it for something else. This won't work in my shader. So if it's not working, if your texture that you have isn't working, make sure it's just the default type. Could have been something else, I'm not sure, but those are other frustrating things that sometimes it's like, hey, I'm doing exactly what the video is doing and my image isn't showing up. So that may be the issue. All right, so we've seen kind of what offset can do just by hand. Now, most of the shaders actually are going to kind of automate this. So what we're going to do is I've added this time node. So let's drag him out of the way. Let's delete him. And now instead of by hand changing the offset, let's take the time and feed that into the Y offset. Let's see what happens. You can already see in the main preview what's happening is that it's moving, right, as time marches up, and time is just spitting out. It starts, actually when you launch a scene, it's going to start at 0 and it's just going to keep counting up basically forever. So let's save that. And now on the scene, you can see that our arrows are moving up in a continual stream. And if I wanted them to go faster, I could put in like a multiplier mode. I'm not going to do that here, but I could put in a multiplier mode to move it faster. Again, if it's going in the wrong direction, I can rotate. Remember, I can rotate in Blender those UVs. I can make them go left to right. If I rotate it 90 degrees, it will go left to right. Let's just try that. Let's rotate this 90 degrees. Export, come into Unity, and now they're going left to right. So you have the flexibility of how your UVs are being mapped in Blender to make it go in any direction you want with the same shader. So we've gone over kind of the basics, but it's important because a lot of times we will feed in various images to do different things with them and interact with our other components. Once you kind of understand all the pieces and what kind of the UV map is, and now you can kind of picture what it's doing, right? The UV comes in, it's being tiled, it's being offset, it's being fed into my sample texture UV. So I'm taking this texture and applying this UV, which starts out as the UV that came in with my mesh, but I'm manipulating it through this tiling and offset node. And then, of course, in the end, I'm exporting that into my base color, which then paints, right, my mesh. So that's pretty much it. Pretty straightforward. Pretty simple once you play around with it and get the basics working. Now, for the videos going forward, we're going to be using this in order and combine it with other images together in order to get some of the cool effects that we want. So, hope this was informative. Hope it all makes sense. Play around with it yourself. Again, you have to feel comfortable, manipulating things in Blender, bringing them into Unity, kind of seeing what happens. So again, thanks for watching, and I'll be working on the next step of shaders, kind of looking into some of the next nodes that we want to be using and possibly combining them with our texture here to get maybe some better looking effects than just some sliding graphics. Not very interesting, but it helps you picture exactly what's going on. So again, thanks for watching. Give it a thumbs up. I have lots of other basic videos on figuring out how all this Unity and Blender works together to make game elements. So, subscribe. Leave a comment about maybe if you're confused about something or what other exact shader nodes you really want me to dig into next. And again, thanks for watching.